The silence inside the sprawling mansion at 1325 Sierra Altaway was heavier than the smog that used to hang over the Los Angeles basin in the old days, a physical weight that pressed against the chest more insistently than the emphysema that had been stealing Dean Martin's breath for years. It was Christmas Day, 1995, and the world outside was likely awash in the garish reds and greens, a holiday that had long ago transformed from a holy observance into a merchandising racket. But inside the drawn curtains of the master suite, the atmosphere was reduced to the grayscale of a flickering television set and the sterile, rhythmic hiss of an oxygen tank. To the public, to the tabloids waiting like vultures for the inevitable headline, the king of cool was dying a recluse, a sad, lonely drunk who had washed out of life the moment his son's phantom jet crashed into that mountain. They whispered that Dino Crocetti had died years ago and only the shell remained, sitting in a stupor of regret. They were wrong. They did not understand that solitude was not a prison for a man like Dean. It was a sanctuary. And on this final night, it was a battlefield where a quiet, invisible heroism was taking place, a spiritual confrontation as intense as any war movie he had ever filmed. Rooted deep in the Italian Catholicism he carried in his marrow and the cultural stoicism of a generation that believed suffering was a private affair between a man and his maker. Dean lay propped up against the pillows, his body frail, the tuxedo elegance stripped away to reveal the mortal architecture beneath. His eyes, usually heavy-lidded with that trademark insouciance, were wide open, staring at the ceiling where the shadows danced. He was not alone because he had been abandoned. He was alone because he had ordered the guard to leave the room. He had sent away the nurses. He had cleared the stage. A performer knows when the finale is coming, and a true professional knows that the most important scenes are played without a supporting cast. He needed to be alone because the visitor he was expecting would not walk to the front door, and the transaction he had complete required a currency that Beverly Hills did not recognize. The air in the room felt charged, static with the electricity of memory. He reached out a trembling hand, not for the tumblers of scotch that had been his prop for 40 years, mostly apple juice, a joke the world never quite got, but for the small, worn object on the nightstand. It was a rosary, black beads worn smooth, the silver crucifix tarnished. It had belonged to his mother, Angela. It smelled faintly of garlic and lavender, the scent of Steubenville, Ohio, the smell of a time before he was Dean Martin, before he was a distinct entity from the holy trinity of Frank and Sammy. The pain in his lungs was a sharp, biting cold, a reminder of the winter winds in Ohio. But Dean accepted it. In the theology of his childhood, pain was penance. He closed his eyes and the room expanded, the walls of the mansion falling away to reveal the smoky interior of a nightclub, the sands, the copa. It didn't matter. The music started, not the brassy swing of the orchestra, but low, hum Gregorian chant that morphed into silent night. He saw them then, the ghosts of Christmas past, not as terrifying specters, but as a captivated audience. There was Sammy, manic and beautiful, spinning in the spotlight. There was Frank, the chairman, looking at Dean with that mixture of brotherly love and professional jealousy. But Dean didn't look at them. He was looking past the lights, into the dark void beyond the stage. He realized suddenly that his coolness, that detached, sleepy demeanor that had made him millions, had never been laziness. It had been a shield. It had been a way to keep the world from seeing how deeply he felt, how terrifyingly much he cared. And tonight, the shield was heavy. He wanted to put it down. "You're making a production out of it, pal lie," he whispered to the empty room, his voice a rasping shadow of the baritone that had sold millions of records. "Just wrap it up." But the room didn't let him go. The shadows lengthened, twisting into shapes that looked uncomfortably like demons. Not the red-horn caricatures, but the gray, shifting forms of despair, regret, and apathy. This was the test. The priest had been there earlier in the week, delivering the last rites, the extreme unction, oil on the forehead, Latin muttered in the air. Dean had nodded, played the part of the penitent, but he knew the real confession wasn't whispered to a man in a collar. It was faced in the silence. The demon of despair sat on the edge of the bed. It looked like the mountain where Dean Paul died. It whispered that nothing mattered, that the laughter was fake, that the songs were vapid, that a life spent entertaining drunk gamblers was a life wasted. It told him that he was dying alone because he was unlovable, that the silence of the house was God's judgment. Dean gripped the rosary tighter. This was a heroic act. To reject the lie, he remembered the feeling of a microphone in his hand. The connection. When he sang, truly sang, he wasn't just crooning for a check. He was taking the loneliness of every person in the audience and holding it for 3 minutes so they didn't have to carry it. He was the patron saint of the highball glass, the comforter of the divorcee, the friend of the guy at the end of the bar. That wasn't nothing. That was charity. I didn't do it for the applause, Dean murmured. His mind clarified with sudden, sharp lucidity. I did it because I knew they were sad. I made them laugh so they wouldn't cry. That's a ministry, isn't it, Ma? He felt a warmth spread through his chest, combating the chill of the oxygen deprivation. He saw his mother's face, stern but loving, nodding in the candlelight of a Depression-era kitchen. The despair shifted, losing its grip. Dean Martin was fighting for his soul, using the only weapons he had. The truth of his intent and the humility to admit that Dino Crocetti was just a man who tried to be kind. But the night was not over. The silence deepened, and a new figure seemed to manifest in the corner of the room, near the artificial glow of the Christmas tree. It wasn't a demon. It was a young man in a flight suit. Dean's heart hammered against his ribs, a broken rhythm. Dean Paul, his golden boy. The grief that calcified Dean's heart for nearly a decade threatened to shatter him now. This was the crux of the battle. To die in peace, he had to forgive God for taking his son. He had to lay down the anger that he had nursed like a dark drink for years. The figure stood silent, waiting. Dean looked at the image of his son, a hallucination born of hypoxia and longing, or perhaps a mercy granted by St. Jude, the patron of hopeless causes. Dean wept. The tears were hot and real, sliding down the deep creases of his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. The king of cool never cried, but Dino did. I missed you, kid, he choked out. I missed you every time I took a breath. The act of weeping broke the dam. The anger flowed out, replaced by profound exhaustion and a strange, luminous clarity. He realized that the aloneness of this Christmas night was a gift. If his family were here, weeping and holding his hands, he would have to perform for them. He would have to be strong Dean, funny Dean, reassuring Dean. He would have to crack a joke to make them feel better about him dying. Alone, he could be weak. Alone, he could be a child again. He could be small before God. He looked at the crucifix on the rosary. I'm tired, boss, he said to the ceiling, addressing the big manager upstairs. The show's been running a little long. I think I'm ready to close the tab. Suddenly, the room was filled with music, not the recordings, but a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very atoms of the air. It was a choir, vast and resonant, singing the Kyrie eleison. Dean felt his body growing lighter. The heavy duvet felt like a cloud. He looked toward the window and saw that the curtains had become transparent. Outside, it wasn't Beverly Hills. It was a snowy street in Steubenville, illuminated by the warm, amber glow of street lamps. There were carolers on the corner. He smelled roasted chestnuts and pipe tobacco. He tried to sit up and found that he could. The oxygen tube fell away. The pain in his chest, the constant companion of the last 5 years, simply evaporated. He looked down at his hands. They were strong again, the liver spots gone. The tremors ceased. He was wearing his tuxedo, the one with the red pocket square, crisp and tailored. He stood up from the bed, leaving the frail shell of the old man behind without a backward glance. He walked toward the door of his bedroom, which now looked like the stage entrance of the greatest theater he had ever seen. He adjusted his cufflinks, a reflexive habit. He felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned. It was Dean Paul, smiling, healthy, whole. "Merry Christmas, Pop," his son said. The joy that exploded in Dean's heart was brighter than a Vegas marquee. He embraced his son, a tangible, solid embrace. There were no words for this reunion, only a sense of rightness, of a chord finally resolving. "You ready?" Dean Paul asked, gesturing toward the light beyond the door. "Yeah," Dean said, his voice rich and smooth, the velvet restored. "Yeah, I'm ready. Is the band here?" "Everyone's here," his son promised. "And the drinks are free." Dean Martin straightened his tie. He realized now the truth of his last night. He hadn't been waiting to die. He had been waiting to be born. The solitude was the womb. The silence was the breath before the song. He turned back one last time to look at the room where his earthly body lay. He saw the rosary clutched in the old man's hand. He saw the peace on the face that the world would find the next morning. They would say he died of respiratory failure. They would write tragedies about the lonely star. But Dean knew the truth. He smiled that crooked, half-smile that had melted hearts for 50 years. "That's amore," he quipped softly. He walked through the door, his arm around his son, stepping out of the shadows of 1325 Sierra Altaway and into a light that was warm, gold, and eternal. As he crossed the threshold, the silence of the house was broken not by weeping, but by the faint, inexplicable sound of a glass clinking against a bottle, a toast to a life that had played the fool to hide the saint, a man who had stayed behind to close the shop and make sure everyone else got home safely before he turned out the lights. The morning sun of December 26 broke over Los Angeles with a harsh, bright clarity, oblivious to the departure of legends. When the staff found him, the house was still quiet. The television had turned to static. The Christmas tree lights were still twinkling, casting multicolored reflections on the unmoving form of the man who had defined an era. The nurse, a devout Mexican woman named Maria, who had cared for him in his final months, crossed herself when she entered the room. She expected to feel the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of death, the kind that usually lingers in the rooms of the wealthy and lonely. Instead, she stopped, puzzled. The room felt light. It felt peaceful. There was a stillness that didn't speak of abandonment, but of completion. She walked to the bedside and saw the rosary entangled in his fingers. She noticed that the tension that had lined his forehead for months was gone. He looked younger. He looked like he had just heard a joke that he couldn't wait to tell. Maria moved to turn off the oxygen machine, the silence rushing back in to fill the void. She picked up the phone to make the necessary calls, to trigger the avalanche of media, lawyers, and undertakers. But for a moment, she held the receiver against her chest, looking at the man. She remembered the stories he would tell her when he was lucid. Stories not about Sinatra or Marilyn Monroe, but about his grandmother, about the taste of pasta fagioli, about the way the church bells rang in Ohio. She realized that the world had lost Dean Martin, the icon, the drunk, the womanizer, the cool guy, but God had reclaimed Dino, the altar boy who had lost his way and found it again in the quiet dignity of a lonely Christmas. She dialed the number. "He's gone," she said softly into the receiver. "Yes, Christmas night." She listened to the voice on the other end, probably an agent or a manager, expressing shock, asking if he was in pain, asking if he was alone. Maria looked at the rosary, then at the empty chair where she sometimes imagined she saw a young man in a flight suit sitting during the long nights. "No," Maria said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "No, sir, he wasn't alone. I don't think he was alone at all." As the news broke and the tributes began to flood the airwaves, clips of the Dean Martin show played on loop in living rooms across America. Dean sliding down the fire pole. Dean holding a cigarette. Dean laughing as Foster Brooks pretended to be drunker than he was. The world mourned the laughter. But deep in the ethos of the time, in the hearts of men who had fought in the wars and the women who had raised families on meager wages, there was a different kind of mourning. They felt the loss of a certain kind of masculine grace, an era where you didn't complain, you didn't explain, and you kept your rosary in your pocket next to your lighter. The heroic nature of his death remained a secret, written only in the book of life. It wasn't heroic because he saved a busload of children or defused a bomb. It was heroic because he had faced the ultimate enemy, meaninglessness, and held his ground. He had refused to let the tragedy of his son's death turn him into a blasphemer. He had refused to let the adulation of the world turn him into an idolater of his own image. In the end, he had stripped it all away. He had waited in the dark, in the silence, suffering the air hunger of emphysema, which feels like drowning on dry land, and he had offered it up. In the days that followed, the funeral was held. The flag was draped. The stars came out in black veils and dark suits. Sinatra, frail and failing himself, looked at the casket with a devastation that the cameras couldn't quite capture. He knew that with Dean gone, The music had officially stopped. The Rat Pack was history. But even Frank, with all his power and connections, couldn't see what Dean had seen. He couldn't see the spiritual entourage that had escorted Dino out of Beverly Hills. Years later, a story would circulate among the staff who worked in that neighborhood. The gardener who worked the grounds of Sierra Alta Properties swore that on Christmas Eve, when the wind blew through the canyons just right, you could hear singing, not the radio, but a voice warm and rich, humming a lullaby. And the old-timers, the ones who knew the culture of the 50s, the ones who understood the hidden depths of the men, who wore tuxedos like armor, would nod. They knew that Dean Martin hadn't just died on Christmas. He had kept an appointment. He had finished his set. And somewhere, in a place where the scotch is smooth and the lungs are clear, the show was just getting started. The final truth, the one that would break you if you understood it fully, was that Dean Martin's drunken persona was the greatest act of humility in show business. He played the fool so others could feel superior. He played the drunk so others could feel sober. He took the judgment of the world and laughed at it, absorbing the criticism so his friends could shine brighter. He was the canvas, not the paint. And on that last night, when the canvas was stripped bare, the masterpiece was revealed, a soul that had endured the crushing weight of grief without losing capacity to love. He died alone so that he wouldn't burden anyone with his departure. He died alone so that his reunion with his son would be undivided. He died alone because, in the end, we all walked through that door single file, and he wanted to show us how to do it with style. The legend says he died of emphysema. The truth is, he died of a broken heart that finally healed enough to stop beating. The last thing he saw wasn't the darkness of a lonely room, but the light of a runway, clear for takeoff, with his son in the cockpit and the flight plan filed for home. And as the world woke up to unwrapped presents and stale eggnog, Dino Crocetti was already singing the opening number of The Heavenly Host, proving once and for all that everybody loves somebody sometime, and that God, in his infinite mercy, loved the singer most of all. The curtain fell, the house lights came up, and for the first time in his life, Dean Martin was truly, completely, and eternally sober on the high wine of grace.